And I've titled today, the title of the whole series is called Distinctions, but today's sermon is titled God Beyond Creation, and you can see it there on the screen. And while I've titled it that way, I want you to understand that today we are not going into a proof of God's existence. That is not my purpose today. There are a great many works out there. There's all kinds of authors that have put a lot of ink on paper to help you with proofs for the existence of God. But beyond that, there are literally millions, dare I say hundreds of millions of testimonies out there that provide evidence to the reality of God in people's lives. And look, if you can discount millions of testimonies, there's not much I'm going to say from this stage that's going to prove anything to you, and I'm not going to do that. So I instead am going to operate on the presumption of God's existence, and I'm going to operate on the presumption that God has worked and that we can therefore know God. Because if God is up there and has not worked and has not done anything, then there's really no way that we can know that he exists or doesn't exist, and quite honestly, it doesn't matter, does it? And so we're going to operate on those two presumptions. One, God exists, and second, that he is the source and foundation of all that we perceive around us, that is to say, the reality that we understand. So that's our starting point in this series. God is. Got it? And since we then cannot observe God, because we can't really observe God at least through our five senses, but we can know God in a variety of ways. We can know him by what he chooses to reveal to us about himself and his purposes. And we can know him by how he moves in what he does. And so we have to be willing to accept, that's part of this whole challenge, we have to be willing to accept what he shares when he shares it with meekness and humility. Because if we aren't going to be meek and humility, we're going to miss everything that he shares. It does no good, and it is, in fact, it's intellectually incoherent to say that God exists and then I get to decide how he exists or how he relates to me or what he intended for my life or indeed how he made me. I don't get to make those choices for myself. If he's God, he's the one that has the right to tell me all of those things. And we have to be then meek and humble to look at what he has told us about himself and how he's revealed himself and then follow that evidence. That's our responsibility as human beings. So today we're going to begin our series called Distinctions, as I said, in which this series, we're just going to look at 4 chapters of Genesis. In fact, we're not even going to look at all 4 chapters equally. We're going to spend a whole lot of time in chapter 1, and then chapter 4 we might have 1 week on. But we're going to look at the first 4 chapters of Genesis because really what I'm going to show you throughout this series, and it's going to take us all the way through spring break, what I hope to show you through this series is how God has ordered his creation and what that means for us as we examine what he's done in his creative work, what it tells us about God, what it tells us about ourselves. So we're going to be discussing the effects of God's perfections so that we can understand them, that is, his perfections. It is not so that we can understand ourselves, although that might be a happy byproduct of everything that we discuss. It's so that we can understand God's perfections, because when he created out of his perfections. I keep using that word. It's not a term that we use every day, is it? The perfections of God. Now, if you grew up in the Reformed tradition or if you grew up in a Catholic catechism, you might understand that term a little bit better than those of us that didn't grow up in those traditions. But what do I mean by God's perfections? God's perfections are his characteristics, his love, his goodness, his omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, his eternality, his sovereignty, and I could go on. I'm not trying to make a comprehensive list in terms of this. Well, we're going to be seeing how his perfections, those kinds of things, the character and nature of God, work out in his creation, because they do. So when I say that he created out of his perfections, what I mean is that he created just as any worthy artist creates. Now, I use that adjective worthy because there are a lot of people who think they're artists who maybe shouldn't be. Me included, I've created artwork before, and I shouldn't have. I mean, we're the artists. We're the artists who understand what art is about and what they're attempting to do with their artwork. They are creating out of their nature, out of the core of who they are, if they are really good at what they do, if they understand what their purpose is and what they're trying to do as artists. And so what that means is that his creation, God's creation itself, reveals quite a bit about who God is because he's the artist. So what we're going to find as we look through this, there's no whimsy or accidental goodness that creates something that we just happen to enjoy. It's all with purpose. Very interesting that Grant would use that as his introduction to his prayer. I didn't tell him that that's where I was going today, but that's where we're going today. The choices that God makes in his creation of you and me are all intentional. And you might think to yourself, I wish he wasn't quite so intentional in certain aspects. You know, a little off here would be good, God. Just saying. But what we're going to see is that all of these choices were influenced by his qualities, by his eternal qualities, by his nature, by his perfections. So when we look at his creation, then we need to acknowledge the distinctions that we see in his creation, because there are distinct things that he has created, and they tell us different things. That's why acknowledging the distinctions are good, because they tell us different things. Each distinction tells us a different thing about the qualities and nature of who God is. And contrary to the arguments that you may be seeing in our culture today, acknowledging distinctions is actually good. That's going to be kind of the thesis of my argument. Because there are these kinds of distinctions. There is good and bad. That's a distinction. There is truth and lie. There is order and there is disorder. There is purpose and there is aimlessness. There is work and there is rest. There is community and isolation, obedience and disobedience, honor and anger, man and woman, God and creation. Those are all distinctions that we see in the first 4 chapters of Genesis, and that's what we're going to be exploring. So for someone to say God didn't intend to create those distinctions would be like saying the only reason why there's a riot of color on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is because Michelangelo spilled some paint. He was intentional, and everybody knows it when you look at the beauty that is the Sistine Chapel. So in this series, we're going to be looking at the order that God establishes in these first 4 chapters of Genesis, and we're going to examine these distinctions that we find here in these first 4 chapters and what they tell us about God, what they tell us about his purposes, and what they tell us about ourselves. So I keep using that word distinctions. What do I mean by that? Well, here's my working definition of this. Distinctions. First definition is a verb. It may say noun up there. Sorry, that was supposed to say V. Verb, the act, there you go, it's a noun. A verb. It can't be a noun because it can't be an act if it's a noun. English 101, Matt. Okay, the act of distinguishing or denoting the differences between objects or the qualities by which one is known from others. Exercise of discernment, discrimination. Ooh, that word. Here's the second definition. Noun, that which distinguishes one thing from another. Distinguishing quality, sharply defined difference, as the distinction between real and apparent good. What do I mean by that? There's some weight there, isn't there? Well, we're going to get into that. It's going to be fun. All right, so there's an argument, obviously, that's being made in the culture today that we should not make distinctions. In fact, when you look at that verb definition, you see discrimination. We shouldn't do that, should we? I mean, differences shouldn't be pointed out. In fact, perceived differences must be blurred as much as they possibly can be. We shouldn't notice stuff. You may be familiar with this quote from Ingrid Newkirk, who's the president of PETA. She said very famously in 1989, "A rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy." Meaning, there's no inherent difference between those things that I just said. There's no distinction in terms of their value. They're all equally valuable. I think statements like that are a huge error. These distinctions exist and they tell us important things about God. They tell us important things about ourselves. They tell us important things about his purposes. And in order for you and I to order our lives correctly, to get our lives in order the way God intends them to be, then we must understand the distinctions that he has set into place, and we must acknowledge them. Because the differences and distinctions that exist in our world are God-ordained, and they are, by definition, therefore, good. In fact, they're very good. This is what God tells us at the very end of his creative work. At the end of Genesis chapter 1 and verse 31, he says, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good." So therefore, all the variety that we see in God's creation should be embraced by those who want to and desire to honor God, because they extend from the nature and character of God himself. And if you deny them, what you're doing is you're missing something. If you try to blur the lines, you're going to miss something about the nature and character. If you destroy them, you're going to destroy something that reveals who he is. It'd be like spray painting over the Mona Lisa or trying to carve a masterpiece out of Michelangelo's David. That would be stupid, wouldn't it? I can make it better than he did. Of course, even as I talk about this, what I'm revealing in my introduction is the very first distinction, the foundation by which we view and understand all the other distinctions, the distinction between God and creation. God is not his creation. That's our first distinction. So today